When I opened the front door and saw him standing there, holding my dog's leash like it was something sacred, my heart did something strange. It didn't skip, it twisted. He smiled, not a rehearsed smile, but the kind that crept up slowly, unsure if it belonged. My dog barked once, tugging me forward as if she had sensed something I hadn't yet admitted to myself. The leash was a trivial excuse. We both knew that. And yet I took it from his hand, fingers brushing, eyes meeting, and the silence between us filled with something dangerously alive. I wasn't looking for anything. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. I was just being polite. Just helping out. But in the back of my mind, I knew. There are moments that unfold like a quiet rebellion, no thunder, no crash, just a breath held too long. That was one of them. The day I agreed to help him with his dog was the day I stopped sleepwalking through my life. And if you've ever looked at someone and felt your skin remember what it was like to be noticed, you'll understand what I mean. But before I explain how everything spiraled, how I ended up packing my bags with trembling hands while my husband slept just meters away, tell me something. Have you ever crossed a line without meaning to, only to realize too late that it was never a line, but a cliff? There are certain mornings that feel colder than they should, even if the thermostat insists everything is fine. That particular morning, I woke up to the sound of the kettle boiling in the kitchen, not because someone had turned it on, but because I had imagined it. That's how long it had been since anyone made me tea. The sheets beside me were still warm from his body, but the man who had left them was already halfway through his routine. He never kissed me good morning anymore, not because we fought, but because we had quietly forgotten how. It's odd how peace can sometimes feel like absence. I sat up slowly, letting the covers fall from my shoulders. I reached for my robe but hesitated, choosing instead to stay still for a moment. There was something about the silence in the room that made my skin crawl, not out of fear, but memory. I used to love this silence when we were younger. Now it felt like a verdict. When I finally made my way to the bathroom, I caught my reflection in the mirror. Not terrible. Not young, not old. Just there. I ran my fingers through my hair and reached for a lipstick I hadn't used in months. The color was subtle, but noticeable. I had no reason to wear it. But I did anyway. Downstairs, he was already dressed and scrolling through his phone at the kitchen table. He glanced up when I entered, gave me a nod, and returned to whatever screen held his attention. I wanted to ask him something, anything, but couldn't think of a single question that didn't sound like an accusation. So I made coffee instead. The routine continued. He left for work with a brief "see you tonight," and I stood by the window long enough to watch his car disappear around the corner. Then I turned to the rest of the day, which stretched before me like a hallway with too many closed doors. Later that afternoon, I took the trash out, an excuse to breathe fresh air more than anything else. That's when I saw him again. My neighbor. He was in his yard, untangling the leash from the gate while his golden retriever danced circles around him. He looked up and waved, the sun catching in the silver strands of his hair. I waved back, casually, as if I hadn't paused my steps. "Hey," he called out, stepping closer to the fence. "Sorry to ask, but would you mind helping out with her tomorrow? I've got to leave town for the day, and the usual sitter cancelled." I hesitated, but only for a second. "Of course," I said. "I'd be happy to." The next morning, the dog greeted me like I was her favorite person in the world. She had that way of looking at you like she saw something good, something worth wagging her tail over. I walked her through the neighborhood, feeling strangely exposed and oddly calm. It was quiet, but not lonely. For once. When I returned, he was already home. "You're a lifesaver," he said, holding open his gate. "Want to come in for a moment? I've got fresh coffee." I almost said no. I almost mentioned laundry, dishes, errands, but the word sure came out faster than I could stop it. His house smelled like cedar wood and coffee grounds. It was tidy, but not sterile. Lived in. A photo of him with a younger woman and two boys sat on a shelf by the stairs. I looked at it longer than I should have. "She's in France now," he said quietly, following my gaze. "The boys are grown. I mostly talk to the dog these days." We sat in the kitchen, mugs in hand, the conversation flowing in that effortless way you only find with people who don't expect anything from you. He made me laugh, really laugh. And when I stood to leave, he walked me to the door, one hand resting lightly on my arm. That touch stayed with me the entire day. Later that night, my husband came home, greeted me with the same nod as always, and disappeared into his office. I wanted to tell him about the walk. About the dog. About the coffee. But the words died somewhere in the gap between us. That night, lying in bed beside a man who had once been the center of my universe, I stared at the ceiling and listened to the soft breathing beside me. It was steady. Familiar. Safe. And yet, something inside me ached, not for danger, not for passion, but for attention. For presence. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the last time someone looked at me like I was still becoming, not already done. The image that came to mind wasn't my husband's face. It was someone else's. And that realization settled into my chest like a stone at the bottom of a still lake. In the dark, I reached for my phone. No messages. No missed calls. No surprises. Just the usual silence. But outside my window, I heard the distant jingle of a leash and the quiet, rhythmic patter of paws on pavement. And without knowing why, I smiled. The next morning felt different in a way that was difficult to explain. I woke up before the alarm, not out of restlessness, but because something inside me was already alert, already waiting. My husband lay beside me, mouth slightly open, breathing shallow and steady. I studied his profile in the dim light. The face I had memorized over decades now felt distant, not unfamiliar, but far away, like a song I hadn't listened to in years. I got up quietly, careful not to disturb him. In the bathroom, I lingered over my reflection. I brushed my hair with more care than usual, applied a touch of mascara, a dab of foundation, and the same subtle lipstick from yesterday. I didn't feel vain. I felt curious, as if trying to remember who I used to be before I began fading into the wallpaper of my own life. Downstairs, I put on a jacket and found the leash hanging by the door. The dog was already waiting, her tail thumping with excitement. She looked at me like I was her person. It was absurd how comforting that felt. We walked a different route that morning, down streets I hadn't seen in years. The sun peeked through the branches in uneven patches, casting shadows that danced on the pavement. With each step, I felt a little more present in my own skin, as if the act of walking this eager animal somehow reconnected me to gravity, to breath, to sensation. Halfway through the route, I spotted him. He was standing by a bench under the oak trees, holding a takeaway coffee cup, the leash of another dog loosely wrapped around his wrist. When he saw me, he smiled in that same slow way, half invitation, half uncertainty. I almost waved and kept walking. Almost. Instead, I paused. He nodded toward the bench, and I walked over without speaking. We stood a few feet apart, the dogs sniffing and circling each other, and the silence between us was thick but not awkward. It hummed with something I couldn't name. "You're early," he said finally, offering me the extra cup of coffee. I took it. "I couldn't sleep," I replied. "Felt like walking." He nodded. "She likes you. The dog, I mean. Follows you like she's known you forever." I smiled faintly, watching the two animals settle near our feet. Maybe we both needed someone to walk with. We sipped in silence for a few moments. The air was crisp, the kind that carried the scent of leaves and old wood. Around us, the world moved in slow, deliberate rhythms, joggers passing by, a child on a scooter, birds darting overhead. And then it happened. No grand declaration, no romantic build-up. Just a look. His eyes found mine and held there, unblinking, and I saw in them something that both scared and comforted me, recognition. A mirror, maybe. A quiet kind of seeing. I didn't think. I didn't even breathe. We stepped closer at the same time, and then, we kissed. We kissed. There's no other way to say it. It wasn't planned, it wasn't forced. It simply was. And when it ended, we didn't speak. We didn't need to. I stepped back first, fingers trembling slightly as they tightened around the coffee cup. He looked down at the ground, then back at me. I couldn't read his expression, or maybe I didn't want to. I should get her home, I said, nodding toward the dog. My voice was steady. Too steady. Yeah, he murmured. Of course. We parted ways without another word. The walk back felt longer than before. My hands were cold, even with the cup still warm between them. My heart was beating too fast, and yet everything outside moved in perfect, unbothered calm. As if nothing had changed. As if I hadn't just crossed a line I couldn't uncross. Back home, I removed my shoes and hung up the leash like it was any other day. My husband was still upstairs, the bathroom fan humming behind the closed door. I stood in the hallway, unsure of what to do with myself. The guilt didn't come immediately. What came first was a strange weightlessness, like I had leapt from a ledge and was still suspended in the air, not yet falling, not yet crashing. Eventually, I moved into the kitchen and began making breakfast. The rhythm of chopping, scrambling, pouring helped anchor me. It was almost comforting, the predictability of it. Eggs, toast, coffee. No questions. No deviations. He came down 15 minutes later, freshly showered, scrolling through his phone. Smells good, he said, sitting at the table. Just the usual, I replied, setting a plate in front of him. We ate in silence, save for the occasional sound of a fork against ceramic. He glanced at me once, maybe twice, but said nothing more. And I kept my face neutral, my posture casual. My insides, however, were anything but still. They churned quietly, somewhere between nausea and adrenaline. When he left for work, I watched his car pull away again. Only this time, I didn't feel like I was being left behind. I felt like I had left already, in a way no one had noticed yet. I spent the rest of the day moving through motions. Laundry, vacuuming, organizing the spice rack. It felt almost absurd, this return to normalcy after such a moment. I kept waiting for something dramatic to happen, a phone call, a knock on the door, a reckoning of some kind. But nothing did. The world didn't stop spinning just because I had changed. That evening, I sat on the couch with a book I couldn't focus on. My husband worked on his laptop, the glow of the screen casting pale light across his face. We were both there, sharing the same space, breathing the same air, but the distance between us could have filled oceans. He looked up at one point and asked about dinner. I told him I wasn't hungry. He nodded, barely registering it, and returned to his typing. I watched him for a long time after that. Not in judgment. Not in anger. In mourning. Not of him. Of us. Because somewhere along the way, we had stopped being anything more than the people who paid the same bills and occupied the same house. And now I wasn't sure if I wanted to fix it. Not because I didn't care. But because I was starting to remember what it felt like to be seen. To be someone. To matter. And that memory was dangerous. It had teeth. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, tracing the outline of the chandelier above me as if it held answers. My husband was beside me, his breathing even, arms tucked under the pillow in that familiar, rigid way he always slept. There was no warmth between us, not because he was cold, but because I had pulled away without moving an inch. The kiss from earlier, those 2 seconds, had rooted itself somewhere deep inside me. Not as a betrayal, though I knew that's what it was. Not as excitement, though my heart had certainly quickened. It lodged itself more as a question, sharp-edged and unavoidable. How did we get here? And worse, when did I stop noticing? In the morning, I went through the motions. I folded the throw blankets on the couch. I emptied the dishwasher. I answered an email from my sister about an upcoming birthday dinner we both knew would be more obligation than celebration. The usual rituals of a life that looked neat from the outside. And yet I moved differently. Not dramatically. Just softer. As if a part of me had turned down the volume on everything else. He came down late, already dressed for work, briefcase in hand. I asked if he wanted coffee. He shook his head and said he'd grab some on the way. No eye contact. No questions. It was as if we had both silently agreed to pretend everything was fine, even though I was certain he hadn't noticed anything had shifted at all. After he left, I sat on the edge of the bed with the leash in my hand. My thumb rubbed the worn leather absent-mindedly. I hadn't planned to walk the dog again today, but something about the way she looked at me when I passed the fence made it feel less like a decision and more like a necessity. He was already outside, throwing a ball back and forth, when I walked over. We didn't say anything at first. The dog bounded over to me, tail wagging wildly, tongue out in a wide, toothy grin. I crouched to pet her, allowing my face to hide behind her fur for a second longer than necessary. Eventually, he handed me the leash and said he'd be out for a few hours, asked if I could keep her a bit longer. I nodded. We didn't mention yesterday. We didn't have to. The space between us held it like a fragile truce. The walk felt heavier today. Maybe because I kept thinking about what I hadn't done, what I hadn't said. Maybe because guilt doesn't announce itself with fanfare, but rather with the quiet ache of knowing you're still hiding something from yourself. I stopped by the lake on the edge of the park. Sat on a bench. The water barely rippled, just enough to reflect the clouds overhead in jagged, trembling shapes. The dog lay beside me, panting softly, her head resting on my foot. And in that moment, the absurdity of it all hit me, that something as small as helping with a dog could tip my world off its axis. But it wasn't the dog. It wasn't even the kiss. It was the absence of something else, the absence that had been building for years. I had ignored it for so long, convinced myself that maturity meant compromise, that comfort was enough. That the kind of longing I used to know had simply expired, like a coupon left too long in a drawer. That evening, my husband came home with takeout from the Italian place we used to love. He set the bag on the counter without a word, rummaged through drawers for plates, and handed me one with a plastic fork. I thanked him. He nodded. We ate in silence. Halfway through the meal, he said, "You were out today?" I looked up, surprised. Yes. Walked the neighbor's dog again. He wiped his mouth with a napkin. You seem to enjoy that. I nodded slowly. She's good company. He didn't say anything after that. Just chewed slowly and stared at the wall, as if something there might be more interesting than this quiet dinner with his wife. I waited for him to finish, cleared the plates, and washed them even though they were made of plastic. My hands lingered under the warm water, scrubbing nothing. When I came back into the living room, he was watching the news. I sat on the opposite side of the couch, arms crossed over my stomach, as if holding myself together. The screen flickered with headlines I couldn't process. My mind was somewhere else, in the park, by the lake, beside someone who had looked at me like I was still alive. He turned to me suddenly. "Do you want to do something this weekend? Maybe get away for a night?" It caught me off guard. He hadn't suggested anything spontaneous in years. "Where would we go?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even. "I don't know," he said, shrugging. "Just somewhere. I thought it might be nice." I nodded, unsure how to respond. Was this guilt? Was this a coincidence? Or maybe, just maybe, he sensed something too, and this was his way of patching the gap without naming it. I went to bed early that night, feigning exhaustion. When he joined me, he lay closer than usual, his arm grazing mine. I didn't move away. But I didn't lean in either. I closed my eyes and listened to the familiar rhythm of his breath. It didn't soothe me. In the dark, I thought about how strange it was that I hadn't lied to him. I hadn't hidden anything. And yet everything inside me felt hidden, not because I wanted to deceive, but because I didn't know how to speak the truth without breaking everything. The next morning, I found a small envelope tucked near the fruit bowl on the kitchen counter. My name was written in his handwriting, the one he used on birthday cards and anniversary notes, the one I hadn't seen in a long time. Inside was a card. Simple. No decoration. Just a single line, "You looked happy yesterday." It was nice to see. I held it for a long time. My fingers trembled. He had noticed. Not the kiss. Not the change in routine. But the expression on my face, one I hadn't worn around him in years. And it scared me. Not because I was caught. But because I wasn't ready to decide what it meant. There's something about a handwritten note that lingers longer than it should. Especially when it's from someone you've shared decades with, someone whose handwriting you could recognize on a crumpled receipt in a sea of strangers' scribbles. I left the card on the counter, untouched, but its words followed me everywhere I went. "You looked happy yesterday. It was nice to see." What did he see, exactly? A lighter step? A quieter hum under my breath? A face turned toward the sunlight instead of away from it? Or had he noticed the thing I had tried not to notice myself, that I was beginning to feel again? I didn't bring it up. Neither did he. The card stayed where it was all day. Neither moved it. We danced around it in our own ways, silent acknowledgments passing like ghosts through the house. Around noon, I opened the hall closet and pulled out an old tote bag. I placed inside it the leash, a small blanket, a water bottle, and a handful of dog treats I found in a drawer. It felt mechanical, like packing for a child. I wasn't sure why I was doing it. Perhaps to pretend there was a purpose, a task to complete. Perhaps to avoid confronting the truth that I didn't want to stay inside that house any longer than I had to. When I stepped outside, the air was unseasonably warm. The sun filtered through the thinning leaves, casting golden patterns on the sidewalk. The dog was already waiting for me by the gate, tail wagging, tongue lolling happily. She trotted over with the unburdened joy that only animals seem to master. I clipped the leash and offered a soft smile to no one in particular. He wasn't in the yard. I assumed he had left or was busy, and I told myself that was fine. Better, even. Cleaner. We needed distance. Boundaries. And yet, as I turned the corner onto the walking path, I saw him jogging toward me from the other direction, earbuds in, shirt damp with sweat. He slowed when he saw me, pulled out one earbud, and gave a breathless half-smile. "Didn't expect to see you today." I shrugged. She seemed eager. He nodded, eyes scanning my face. I wondered what he was searching for: regret, hesitation, guilt. Whatever it was, he didn't find it, or at least he didn't show it. Instead, he stepped aside to let me pass, and I thought that would be it. But then he turned and fell into step beside me. We walked in silence. It was different now, not awkward, but not comfortable either. It was a silence trying to decide what it wanted to be. I think he knows, I said finally. I wasn't sure why. He didn't ask who. He didn't have to. Because of the kiss, he asked, carefully, as if testing the weight of the word. No, I said. Because I smiled. He let out a soft, almost inaudible chuckle. Not mocking, understanding. He nodded but didn't comment further. I don't want to do anything stupid, I added after a while. He glanced at me. Too late? I laughed then, short, bitter, honest. Probably. We stopped at the bench near the water. The dog settled at our feet. The breeze picked up, sending a few leaves tumbling across the grass like they were late for something. I'm leaving next week, he said. My stomach tightened. Where? Just a few hours north. Work opportunity. I haven't decided yet. I didn't respond immediately. I stared at the water instead, at the reflection of sky fractured by ripples. It felt like looking into a version of my life I could no longer trust, familiar and unreachable all at once. You should go, I said finally. If it's good for you. He looked down, nodding slowly. Would you miss me? The question was quiet, casual, but it sat heavily between us. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. We didn't speak much after that. The walk home was subdued. When we reached his gate, he paused. I'm not trying to make things difficult, he said. I never wanted that. I know, I replied. He stepped back, gave a slight nod, and disappeared inside. Back home, my husband was in the garage, tinkering with something on the workbench he hadn't used in years. I watched him through the window for a few minutes. His movements were careful, precise. He wiped his hands on an old rag and looked up, sensing something, perhaps. Our eyes met through the glass, and for a second, it felt like we were strangers observing each other's lives through panes we didn't know how to break. I turned away first. Later that evening, he brought up the idea of a weekend away again. Said he found a place by the lake we used to visit. Said it might be nice. I agreed. Not because I wanted to go, but because I didn't want to explain why I didn't. I packed a small bag that night. Simple clothes. Comfortable shoes. I stood in front of the mirror longer than necessary, wondering if he'd noticed the way I looked at my own reflection now. Wondering if I still resembled the woman he married, or if I had quietly become someone else without either of us noticing. We left early the next morning. The drive was quiet but not tense. We listened to old songs, some of which made me smile, others that felt too close. He reached over once, rested a hand on my knee, and I didn't move. But I didn't feel anything either. That scared me more than anything. When we arrived, the cabin was smaller than I remembered, but cozy. The lake shimmered in the distance, its surface calm, mirroring the sky in a way that felt deliberate. We unpacked. Made tea. Sat on the porch. Talked about weather, traffic, things that didn't matter. And when the silence grew longer, he turned to me and asked, "Are you happy?" The question startled me. I wanted to lie. I wanted to say yes, because that was what I was supposed to say. That was the kind of question you answered kindly, even if it wasn't true. But instead, I said nothing. He didn't push. That night, we lay in bed with inches between us that felt like miles. I stared at the ceiling again, tracing shadows like constellations I couldn't name. And I knew, in that stillness, that I had come not to reconnect, but to confirm something. That what was broken between us couldn't be repaired by proximity, or lake views, or borrowed memories. That sometimes the simplest truth is also the hardest to admit. I had stopped being his long before I kissed someone else. The ride back from the lake was quiet in a way that didn't feel peaceful. There was no argument, no tension. But also no connection. We had smiled in the right places, eaten at the restaurant where we used to go years ago, and even stood side by side watching the lake turn gold in the late afternoon. And yet, the whole time, I felt like I was rehearsing someone else's memories. Like I was mimicking a version of myself that no longer existed. When we got home, I unpacked the small bag and folded the clothes as if the fabric could tell me something I had missed. I placed them neatly in the drawer and stood there for a moment, staring into the half-empty space as though expecting an answer to appear. The card he had written was still on the counter. I hadn't moved it. He hadn't mentioned it again. But I felt its presence like a whisper in the house. The next morning started like most others. He left early for work. The door closed behind him with the same soft finality it always did. I stood in the hallway listening to the quiet for several minutes. And then, without really deciding to, I grabbed the leash again. The dog greeted me like she'd been waiting for hours. She whined softly, tail wagging uncontrollably, eyes bright with recognition. There was something oddly comforting about that, about being met with that kind of uncomplicated enthusiasm. No expectations. No judgment. Just presence. I walked a longer route than usual, circling through unfamiliar streets before ending up near the park. I didn't expect him to be there. I didn't know if I wanted him to be. But when I saw him standing by the tree line, hands in his pockets, looking in my direction like he wasn't surprised at all, my breath caught in my throat for a second. He walked over slowly, the way someone might approach an animal they're not sure won't run. We didn't say anything for a while. We just stood there, both facing the lake, both pretending not to feel the weight of what was behind us. He was the one who broke the silence. You disappeared for a few days. I went away with him, I said simply. He nodded. Was it good? I hesitated, then said, it was quiet. That seemed to say everything it needed to. He didn't ask more, and I didn't offer. We walked for a while without direction, letting the dogs sniff their way through patches of sunlight. The leash felt like a tether to something simpler, something real, something I could hold without questioning. At one point, we stopped near the small hill that overlooked the playground. Children ran back and forth below, their laughter rising in sharp, happy bursts. I watched a little girl chase a bubble, arms stretched wide, spinning in circles. It made my chest tighten. I used to think I'd feel differently at this age, I said. Like I'd arrive at something. A place. A certainty. He looked at me, and there was a softness in his expression that made it hard to meet his eyes for long. I used to think feeling nothing was safer, he said. Turns out it's just quieter. We both laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was true. Then came the moment I had avoided. The moment I had rehearsed in my head, rewritten 100 different ways. I turned to him and said, we shouldn't keep doing this. He didn't flinch. He just nodded slowly. I know. There's too much I haven't said. Too much he doesn't know, I continued. And whatever this is, it can't exist in the middle of all that. I'm not asking for anything, he said. I never did. I know, I whispered. And then, without warning, without planning, without hesitation. We kissed. We kissed. Not like before. Not out of curiosity. Not out of confusion. But like two people who knew they had reached a wall and had nothing left to say on either side of it. When it ended, I stepped back and looked away. My heart was racing. My hands were cold. "I'm leaving this week," he said quietly. "For real this time." I nodded. "That's probably for the best." "I wanted to say goodbye the right way," he said. "Not like people who pretend it never happened." I nodded again. "Goodbyes don't make it easier." "No," he said. "But they make it honest." I handed him the leash. The dog looked between us, as if sensing the shift. I crouched down and scratched her behind the ears one last time. "She's lucky," I said. "So was I," he replied. I turned and walked away before I could second-guess anything. The air felt thicker, heavier. Like I had just closed a chapter one hadn't been ready to finish. When I got home, the house felt too clean. Too quiet. My husband was working late, which gave me time to sit with everything I had just undone. I brewed tea. I sat at the kitchen table. I looked at the card again. "You looked happy yesterday." It was nice to see. What a simple thing to notice. What a painful thing to admit. Later that evening, he called and said he'd be home in an hour. I stood in front of the mirror again, touching the lines at the corners of my mouth, the tiredness under my eyes. I wasn't trying to hide them. I just wanted to know what he saw when he looked at me. And for the first time in years, I asked myself what I saw. Not who I had been. Not who he remembered. But who I was now, standing in this moment, full of endings I hadn't planned and beginnings I wasn't sure I deserved. And though I didn't have the answers yet, I knew this much. Whatever happened next, it would not be about hiding. It would not be about silence. It would not be about waiting for someone else to notice the cracks. It would be about choosing. For the first time, really choosing. Even if I had no idea what that choice would cost. In the days that followed, I avoided the park. Not consciously, at first. I told myself I was just busy, that errands had piled up, that the laundry needed catching up on, that I had promised to reorganize the guest closet. But underneath it all, I knew the truth. I was giving space to the goodbye I had agreed to. I was trying not to unravel the thread we had carefully tied off before it could unravel on its own. The dog didn't wait for me anymore. I passed by the fence twice without slowing down. On the second day, I noticed the leash was no longer hanging on the hook, and I knew what it meant. He was gone. For real this time. No messages. No explanations. Just absence. The emptiness surprised me, not in its existence, but in how quickly it settled in. I didn't expect closure to feel like a vacuum. I thought it would bring calm, clarity. But instead, it brought a silence I couldn't fill, not with tasks, not with cleaning, not even with the sound of my own breath echoing through the hallways of a house that suddenly felt too large. My husband remained, as always, steady. Predictable. But something between us had shifted, and we both sensed it. He didn't ask about the dog anymore. He didn't mention the card again. He brought home groceries without being asked, cleaned the garage without complaint. These were his ways of reaching out, I think, quiet, habitual gestures instead of words. One evening, he brought home a bottle of wine I hadn't had in years. He didn't ask if I wanted to open it. He just placed it on the counter and said, thought it might be nice. It sat there for 2 days, unopened. On the third night, I opened it myself. Not because I wanted to toast to anything, but because I needed something to anchor the quiet. I poured a glass, took a sip, and sat at the table with an old photo album I hadn't touched in at least a decade. There we were, smiling on the beach, arms slung around each other. There I was, laughing in the kitchen, flour on my nose, while he looked on with a crooked grin. I traced the edges of the photos with my fingertips, as if by touching them, I could re-enter those moments. But they felt like postcards from someone else's life, familiar but not mine anymore. That night, I dreamt of packing. The kind of dream where your hands won't move fast enough, where you forget what you were looking for each time you turn around. In the dream, I kept opening drawers, but they were all empty. I woke up with the image of my suitcase half-zipped, the fabric flapping open like a mouth that couldn't quite speak. The next morning, I knew I had to do something. Not for him. Not even for me. But for the version of myself I kept losing and finding in flashes. The one who had made choices. The one who hadn't waited for her life to become something she no longer recognized. So I cleaned the guest room. I changed the sheets, opened the window, let the afternoon breeze roll through. I donated half my closet. I didn't tell my husband. I didn't need to. The energy in the house had changed, and he felt it. That evening, he joined me on the porch. It had been weeks since we'd sat out there together. We watched the sky turn soft shades of amber and gray, the way it always did just before a storm or just after a long day of heat. He handed me a cup of tea without a word. We sat like that for a long time. At some point, he said, "I keep trying to remember when we stopped talking." I looked at him carefully. I think we didn't notice it was happening. He nodded. Maybe we thought silence meant things were okay. It was easier than asking questions we weren't sure we wanted answered. Another silence followed, but this one was fuller. Not empty, not forced. Just mutual understanding. "I know something changed," he said. "I'm not blind." I looked at the rim of my cup. Something did. He didn't ask for details. He didn't raise his voice. He just sat there with the truth, the way you sit with pain that no longer needs to be dissected, only acknowledged. "I want to try again," he said quietly. "If you do." The offer hung in the air between us. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't dramatic. It was simple. Raw. And I realized I didn't know how to respond. Not because I didn't care. But because I wasn't sure if I still fit into the version of us he was hoping to rebuild. I went to bed early that night. My head was loud with thoughts, but my body was heavy, tired from the effort of holding them all in place. I lay on my side, eyes closed, pretending to sleep when he came in. I felt the bed dip as he lay down beside me. He didn't reach for me. He didn't speak. But he didn't turn away either. I stayed awake for hours, listening to the rain that had started outside. Soft, steady. Like a conversation without words. In the morning, he left for work early again. The house returned to its quiet rhythm. I stood in the kitchen with my coffee, watching the driveway empty itself once more. And that's when I saw it. A small package on the front step. No return address. Just my name in a handwriting I didn't recognize. I opened it slowly, cautiously. Inside was a key. Just a single key on a plain ring. Nothing else. No note. No instructions. I stared at it for a long time, my fingers curling around the cool metal. It didn't make sense. Until I realized it wasn't meant to. Not yet. Some messages don't arrive with explanations. Some choices don't come with guarantees. I placed the key in a drawer and closed it. Then I sat at the table, pulled a notebook toward me, and began to write. Not a letter. Not a confession. Just a beginning. Because endings are rarely sudden. They are stitched slowly, silently, in mornings that feel too quiet and evenings that ache in places we pretend not to notice. And sometimes, without even realizing it, we begin again. The following days moved in a way I could only describe as suspended. Nothing urgent, nothing collapsing, just a held breath. I stayed in the routine because it offered safety, a sense of rhythm, even if it didn't feel like living. But inside me, something had shifted yet again. It wasn't panic. It wasn't clarity. It was simply the weight of awareness. And with it, a growing need to stop pretending that waiting would solve anything. I didn't mention the key. I tucked it deeper into the drawer and went about my days like it hadn't arrived, even though its presence haunted me like a soft vibration at the edge of thought. What kind of person leaves a key without a note? Without a goodbye? Without even checking if it's welcome? And yet, I knew exactly who had. I went to the market. I folded laundry. I called my sister and promised to see her soon. I ignored the mirror more than usual, not because I was ashamed, but because I couldn't quite recognize what was looking back. Then, one afternoon, I found myself walking without planning to. I didn't bring the dog leash. I didn't dress for exercise. I just stepped outside and let my body decide where to go. I ended up near the bus station. The terminal buzzed with distant noise, engines, announcements, rolling luggage. I didn't go inside. I just stood outside, staring at the flow of people coming and going, all of them carrying stories I would never know. And yet somehow, I envied each of them. Not because they were leaving something behind, but because they had made a decision to move. That evening, I came home to an empty house. My husband had texted to say he was working late. I made tea and sat on the porch, watching the light fade from the sky. I didn't feel lonely. I didn't feel abandoned. I felt like I had been offered a pause, a blank page, and the question was whether I would write on it or let it stay untouched. I didn't go to bed right away. Instead, I opened my closet and stood there for a long time, staring at the rows of clothes I had worn through seasons of sameness. I chose a few pieces without thinking too hard. Comfortable. Neutral. I folded them neatly and placed them in a small overnight bag. Then I opened the drawer and took out the key. I held it in my palm, letting the cool metal press into my skin. It felt heavier than it should have. Not because of its size, but because of what it represented, not escape, not fantasy, but a step. A choice. One that could not be undone. I didn't leave a note. I didn't feel the need. I turned off the lights, locked the door behind me, and stepped out into the quiet of the night. The taxi ride was uneventful. The driver didn't make small talk, and I didn't offer any. The streetlights passed over us in rhythmic intervals, like a metronome keeping time with my thoughts. I held the key tight in my hand the entire ride, not in my bag, not in my pocket, just there, visible to me, as if to remind myself that I was the one choosing. He lived across town, in a modest building I had only seen once before. I remembered the blue door. I remembered the uneven step that creaked. I remembered thinking, even then, that this place felt temporary, like a waiting room between chapters. I stood outside for longer than I should have, the key growing warmer in my palm. The air was thick with that summer humidity that makes everything feel slower, heavier. The city around me was still awake, but I felt far from it, like I was floating just above the surface of my own life. I didn't knock. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. It was dark, but not silent. I heard the low hum of a fan, the ticking of a clock on the wall, the sound of something shifting in the next room. I closed the door behind me quietly and leaned against it for a moment, unsure if I was ready for what came next. But then I stepped forward. He appeared in the doorway a moment later, barefoot, holding a glass of water, his expression unreadable. For a second, neither of us moved. We just stared at each other, the space between us dense with everything we hadn't said. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said. "I wasn't either," I replied. No more words were needed. He stepped aside, letting me walk past him into the room. The space was small but warm. A worn couch. A half-read book on the coffee table. A lamp casting soft light across the floor. It smelled faintly of cedar and laundry detergent, and something else I couldn't place, something that reminded me of stillness. I set my bag down without ceremony. I didn't explain myself. I didn't rehearse excuses. I simply let the silence carry the truth. I was here. Not out of impulse. Not out of rebellion. But because I couldn't keep holding the weight of pretending I didn't want to be. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't question. He just sat across from me and watched, giving me space to find my footing in a moment that didn't offer instructions. I breathed deeply. And in that room, away from the rhythm of routine, away from the quiet compromises of a long marriage, away from the image I had maintained for so long, I felt something settle. Not peace, not resolution, but presence. We didn't talk much that night. We didn't try to define anything. We didn't plan the future. We let the hours pass slowly, each minute folding into the next like pages turned without sound. And when morning came, we spent the night together. The morning light in his apartment was softer than I expected. It filtered through the blinds in thin, pale streaks, illuminating floating dust that danced in the air. I lay still for a long time, my eyes tracing the quiet corners of the room, letting my body adjust to the foreign familiarity of it all. The walls were bare, the furniture simple, but there was something comforting in the quiet order of the space. It wasn't home, but it wasn't uncomfortable either. I could hear him moving in the kitchen. The clink of a spoon against a mug, the low hum of the kettle coming to a boil. No music, no talking. Just the small, domestic sounds of a day beginning. The kind of sounds I had once loved in my own home but had grown numb to over the years. When I sat up, the blanket fell to my waist. I pulled it back over my shoulders, more from instinct than modesty. There was no sense of urgency, no panic, but there was weight. A quiet, undeniable weight in my chest, the kind that reminded me this wasn't just another morning. It was the first one after a line had been crossed completely. I stood and dressed in silence, moving slowly, trying not to disturb anything around me. My bag was still by the door where I had left it the night before. I didn't feel the need to rush out, but I didn't want to linger either. When I entered the kitchen, he looked up from pouring tea into two mismatched mugs. "I didn't know how you take it," he said, gesturing to the second cup. "Black is fine," I replied, taking the seat across from him. We sat for a while, sipping without speaking. The quiet between us was not awkward, it was filled with the unspoken understanding that there was nothing left to justify. But still, there were questions floating in the air, invisible but pressing. I placed the cup down carefully. "I have to go home." He nodded. I figured. I didn't leave a note. I just left. Again, no judgment in his face. Just that calm stillness he always carried, like he had already made peace with outcomes long before they arrived. "Do you think he knew?" I asked, surprising myself with the bluntness of it. He looked down for a moment, then back up. "I think he's known something for a while." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The rest of the morning passed quietly. When I stood to leave, he walked me to the door but didn't touch me. He didn't ask when I'd be back. He didn't ask if I'd call. And I didn't offer any promises. The ride home felt like moving through a fog. The city looked different, as if the colors had been desaturated slightly. I tried to focus on small things, the woman walking her toddler along the sidewalk, the cafe that was just opening its patio, a man waiting at a crosswalk with a bouquet of flowers in one hand. All of them living their own lives, unaware that I had just crossed an invisible threshold in mine. When I got to the house, the porch light was still on, though the sun had fully risen. I unlocked the door quietly, as if trying not to wake anyone, though I knew I wouldn't find anyone asleep inside. The house was silent. My husband's car wasn't in the driveway. I stepped inside, set down my bag, and just stood there for a long time. The air felt still. The faint scent of his cologne lingered in the hallway, mixed with the smell of yesterday's coffee and old wood. Everything looked exactly as I had left it, which made it feel even more foreign. As though I had entered a perfectly preserved version of a life I no longer lived in. I moved through the rooms slowly. The kitchen. The living room. The bedroom. Everything in its place. Nothing touched. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the closet door. For a moment, I considered unpacking my bag, sliding my clothes back into their familiar hangers, as if nothing had happened. But I didn't move. Instead, I pulled the notebook from the nightstand drawer. The one I had written in a few days before. I opened to a blank page and stared at it, pen in hand, unable to decide whether to start a new entry or read what I had written last. Eventually, I closed the cover and set it aside. The sun had fully risen now. The house filled with light, but it felt too bright, too honest. I stood and walked to the kitchen, brewed fresh coffee, and sat at the table alone. I didn't touch my phone. I didn't check for messages. I just sat there, letting the silence surround me. He returned around noon. I heard the garage door open, followed by his footsteps down the hall. I didn't rise to greet him. I didn't pretend to be busy. I simply looked up when he entered the room. He stopped in the doorway, eyes scanning my face. He didn't ask where I'd been. He didn't demand answers. But there was something in his expression, worn, quiet, patient, that made my chest tighten. "I made coffee," I said. He nodded and sat across from me. We drank in silence. The seconds stretched between us like thread, thin, fragile, taut. "I thought about calling you," he said finally. "Last night." I swallowed. "Why didn't you?" He shrugged. "I figured if you wanted to be here, you would." I looked down at the table. My fingers traced the grain in the wood absently. "I don't know what I want," I admitted. "I think you do," he said. "You're just afraid to say it out loud." We sat for a while longer. No raised voices. No tears. Just quiet truths beginning to surface, like stones lifted one by one from the bottom of a still pond. Later that evening, I unpacked my bag, not because I was ready, but because it needed to be done. I placed the folded clothes back in their drawers, lined the shoes in the closet, returned the key to its hiding place. I didn't feel better. I didn't feel worse. I just felt awake. And for now, that was enough. The days that followed were ordinary in a way that felt both welcome and unbearable. I moved through them with quiet purposes: laundry, groceries, emails, small talk with neighbors. Nothing out of place, nothing remarkable. But underneath the surface, everything was humming. A low, constant frequency I couldn't turn off. My husband and I existed like two people sharing the same orbit, careful not to collide. There were no confrontations, no sharp words. Just space, measured, intentional, growing a little wider with each passing hour. Sometimes I caught him watching me from across the room. Not accusingly. Not pleading. Just observing. As though he were trying to understand someone he had once known but now found unfamiliar. He still left early every morning. Still came home around 6. Still asked about dinner. Still watered the plants. Still paused at the hallway mirror to check his collar before work. Everything continued as it always had, and yet none of it felt the same. One afternoon, I stood by the kitchen window folding dish towels, and a memory came rushing back. Years ago, when we were first married, he used to come up behind me while I did this exact task, wrap his arms around my waist, and press his face into my neck. No words. Just a moment. Just warmth. That memory hit me with such unexpected force that I had to steady myself against the counter. And then the thought came, I couldn't remember the last time that had happened. Not because of a fight. Not because of some dramatic shift. But because it had slowly, imperceptibly disappeared, like so many other things. That evening, I walked to the edge of our street and sat on the bench by the small garden I had planted years ago. The lavender had come in again, full and fragrant. I ran my hand along the stalks, releasing the scent, trying to remember who I was when I first planted them. Younger, more certain, more hopeful. Someone who believed that effort and love were always enough. As the sun dipped behind the trees, I checked my phone. No messages. I wasn't surprised. I had stopped expecting them. But just as I was about to put the phone away, it vibrated in my hand. A new text. From him. It was brief. Just 2 words, "You okay?" I stared at the screen for a long moment before typing back, "I don't know." There was no immediate reply. I slipped the phone into my pocket and walked home slowly, unsure whether I wanted an answer or silence. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, listening to the soft creak of the house, the distant hum of traffic, the occasional rustle of wind against the windows. My husband was asleep beside me, his breathing steady, his body turned away. At one point, I got up and padded down the hallway to the kitchen. I made tea and stood by the window again, looking out into the dark. The key was still in the drawer. I hadn't touched it since returning home. I didn't know what it meant anymore. A symbol? A mistake? A tether? Eventually, I returned to bed, not because I was tired, but because I didn't know what else to do. In the morning, I woke before him. I sat on the edge of the bed, watching the light begin to stretch across the floor. My bag was still in the closet, now unpacked, but not quite settled. Like me. Present, but uncertain. He stirred beside me, blinking against the light. He didn't say anything at first. Just looked at me. Then, finally, he asked, "Did you sleep?" "Not really." He nodded, sitting up. There was something fragile in the way he moved, like someone handling glass. "I thought about asking you to talk last night," he said. "But I didn't want to push." "I know." Another pause. "Do you still love me?" he asked, not with anger, not with sadness, just openness. I didn't look at him. I looked at my hands instead, resting in my lap. I wanted to answer. I wanted to give him something clear. But all I could say was, "I don't know how to answer that." His silence wasn't disappointed. It was quiet, reflective. He reached for his watch on the nightstand, fastened it slowly. "Well," he said gently, "I love you. Even if I don't know what that means right now." I turned to him then. There was something in his eyes that made mine sting, a rawness, a steadiness I hadn't expected. For a moment, I wondered what it would feel like to start again. Not with someone new, but with him. Not out of guilt or duty, but choice. Later that day, I sat at the kitchen table with a pen in my hand and a blank notepad in front of me. I didn't know what I was writing, only that I needed to. Words came slowly. Half-thoughts, fragments. Truths I had only whispered to myself. I wrote about the silence in our home, about the slow fading of touch, about the days spent waiting for something unnamed. I wrote about the park, about the bench, about the dog's soft eyes. I wrote about being seen. I didn't write about the night. Some things didn't need to be captured in ink to remain real. As I wrote, a sense of calm came over me. Not peace, exactly. Not resolution. But a quiet acceptance of the moment I was in. A knowing that I couldn't unmake what had happened, but I could decide what came next. In the afternoon, I went for a walk. Not to the park. Not to the places filled with memories that still burned at the edges. Just through the neighborhood, streets I'd walked 100 times before, but now felt new. I passed by homes with open windows, laughter spilling out. I passed a woman sweeping her porch, a man teaching his child how to ride a bike. I passed life, unpaused, unflinching. By the time I returned home, my feet ached, but my mind was quieter. That evening, I set the table for two. I made dinner, nothing elaborate, just something warm, something shared. When he came through the door, I met him with a small nod. He looked at the table, then back at me, uncertain. I thought maybe we could talk, I said. He stepped inside, set down his bag, and said, okay. We ate slowly. We spoke softly. We didn't solve anything. But we were present. And in that quiet, shared space, I realized something. Sometimes rebuilding doesn't start with answers. Sometimes it starts with sitting down at the same table again. The morning after our quiet dinner, I awoke with a strange sense of stillness, as though my body and mind had finally come into the same room after wandering in separate directions for far too long. The house felt the same, but something within it had shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to feel like the air was moving again. I made coffee, not out of habit, but because I wanted to. The scent filled the kitchen, warm and steady. I leaned against the counter, watching the steam rise from the mug, trying to put a name to the feeling in my chest. It wasn't peace. It wasn't regret. It was the unfamiliar sensation of being between versions of myself, who I had been, who I had become, and who I might still be. He came into the kitchen a few minutes later, hair slightly tousled, buttoning his shirt. He didn't say much, just gave me a nod and poured his own cup. We stood side by side in silence, our movements overlapping but not colliding. When he reached for the sugar, our hands brushed. He didn't pull away. Neither did I. After he left for work, I sat at the table with my notebook again. I flipped back through the pages, reading bits and pieces of the mess I'd poured onto the paper in recent weeks. There were sentences I didn't remember writing, questions I hadn't yet answered, and memories I had tried to bury between lines. One page caught my eye, not because of the words, but because of the emptiness. A blank space, halfway through the notebook. I stared at it for a while, then began to write, not to confess, not to explain, but to name the things I had learned in silence. I wrote about stillness. About how loud it can become when you're finally ready to listen. I wrote about longing, not as a dramatic ache but as a soft, persistent throb. I wrote about the way familiarity can dull you, and the way absence can sharpen you. And then I wrote one simple line, I'm still here. The sun crept slowly across the kitchen floor as the day moved on. I did small tasks, wiped the counters, opened the windows, watered the plants. There was comfort in the movement, in the physical proof of presence. That afternoon, I returned to the park for the first time in weeks. I didn't expect to see anyone I knew. I wasn't looking for anything. I just walked. The trees were fuller now, their green heavy with the weight of late summer. I paused at the bench by the lake and sat for a while, watching ducks glide across the surface like they had nowhere else to be. Children played in the distance. A couple walked past, their fingers interlocked. A teenager sat nearby, scrolling through his phone with headphones in. Life, as always, continued. And for the first time in a while, I didn't feel like I was watching from the outside. I felt like a quiet part of it. As I stood to leave, a breeze lifted the hem of my shirt slightly, brushing against my skin. I closed my eyes and breathed it in. It didn't smell like a new beginning or a clean slate. It just smelled like the day, present, imperfect, real. When I returned home, there was a note on the counter in my husband's handwriting. "Dinner," it said. "I thought we could cook something together. If you feel like it." There was no pressure in the words. No expectation. Just a quiet invitation. I left the note where it was and headed upstairs. I took a long shower, letting the water run until my thoughts settled. I didn't rush. I didn't rehearse anything in my mind. I just allowed myself to exist for a while, stripped of roles, of stories, of timelines. That evening, we stood side by side in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, measuring spices, trying to remember how to make a dish we hadn't cooked in years. We moved slowly, occasionally brushing elbows, occasionally laughing at forgotten steps. At one point, he looked over at me with a question in his eyes. He didn't ask it. I didn't answer. We just kept cooking. We ate at the table without turning on the television. The air between us was still careful, still delicate, but no longer cold. It was like walking on ice that no longer threatened to crack beneath our feet. After dinner, we lingered in our seats. I watched him finish his wine, and he watched me fold the napkin in slow, deliberate movements. "I don't expect things to go back to how they were," he said eventually. I looked up. "Neither do I. But maybe we can find something different. Something that fits who we are now." It wasn't a proposal. It wasn't a vow. It was a seed. One that might take root. One that might not. But it was honest. I nodded slowly. Maybe. Later that night, as we lay in bed, we didn't speak. We didn't reach for each other. But we didn't turn away either. We lay there quietly, two people not quite healed, not quite broken, suspended in the fragile space between what was and what might be. I thought of him, the neighbor, the dog, the walks, the glances, the moments that had pulled me back to myself in ways I hadn't expected. I didn't regret any of it. I didn't wish to rewrite it. But I understood now that it wasn't about him. It had never truly been. It had been about something I had forgotten, the ability to feel. To be seen. To wake up inside my own skin again. And as I closed my eyes in the dark, I realized something else. This story wasn't about betrayal. It wasn't about escape. It was about returning, to the truth, to presence, to the quiet ache of staying. And sometimes, that's the braver choice.